Welcome. This is David Boles, Human Meme. Today's topic, golfing with my grandfather. My grandfather, William Henry Vodehnal, was a great man who suffered greatly for his moral duty against the illness of others, the geography of the self, and the hard, salted Platte, where love never grew and misery was the only harvest. Grandfather was born in Ord, Nebraska in 1904, current population 2,000, and he made his life 11 miles a little south and a little bit east in a little village called North Loup, Nebraska, population 291. And if you'd like more information and photos of my grandfather, please visit Boles.com, click on Archives, and then look for Founding Authority on that page, and click on the William Henry Vodehnal link. Or just go to Boles.com/archives/Vodehnal, Vodehnal.html, and you'll land directly on the page. My grandfather was a pharmacist who earned his pharmacy degree in Omaha, Nebraska on August 3, 1927, 2 years before the world broke apart in 1929 and the Great Depression destroyed America. And Bill Vodehnal, born on a farm, educated in air conditioning, grew to know the hard value of $1 against a life, and in the lower Loup Valley, he held the village of North Loup, Nebraska, together economically, psychologically, and culturally. If you needed medication and couldn't afford it, Bill Vodehnal would swap you a chicken for a handmade tincture. If you couldn't pay right away, that was okay. Your word was enough. No handshake promise to pay was necessary. And now, today, if you travel to North Loup, Nebraska, and you ask around about Uncle Bill Vodehnal, those who know, those who still remember, will not tell you about the man he was. They'll tell you a story about the life he saved, the favor Bill Vodehnal then did for the sick, the $1 my grandfather offered a destitute family passing through North Loup on their way to higher ground. But no good man stands alone, and Bill Vodehnal had the love of his life, Elfrida, with him, until she wasn't. And she died, suddenly, of a heart attack, a few months after I was born. I never knew my grandmother, but family remember her for me, certain that one day I will know her as well as she knew me. After my grandmother's death, my grandfather lost some of his shine, but never his dedication. Each day started with awakening to the morning whistle, followed by a quick walk to the pharmacy 2 blocks away. And he'd work for a few hours, close for lunch, then go back at it until the 5 o'clock whistle blew, or the sunset. And if there was an emergency at any time, any day of the week, any holiday, the home phone would ring, and Bill Vodehnal would get up from whatever he was doing and meet you in the store in 5 minutes. Healing never waited. Satisfaction of duty overruled any personal strife or discomfort. And yes, oftentimes duty is drudgery, and taking a vacation or taking time off was just not done. People don't wait for you to return to get sick. And even taking a single day off was a major event that caused timing and scheduling issues. Like Bartleby before him, for Bill Vodehnal, sometimes it was just better not to than to make arrangements for someone else to watch the store. As a child, when I visited my grandfather, and I would spend the day with him in the store, I would read comic books and play with toys for sale, and I'd shoot medicine bottles with a BB gun in the lot behind the pharmacy. And I am told my grandfather was fond of me, and I believe what I am told. But there was also a cool distance between us. Not too much emotional sharing and expression was offered, because caring was weakness, and there was strength in the cold. Duty was strong and unabiding. Getting things done was the sharpest proof of love he could offer. And if you behaved, you were well liked. If you made a noise, you were glowered at. Not being in trouble was evidence enough of being allowed to be out of sight and mind. Because there was respect in isolation. Your freedom was yours only if you didn't demand attention. During one odd stretch in my childhood, I was left to visit my grandfather for 2 weeks. That had never happened before, and I later discovered my mother was getting rid of her second husband in Lincoln, 3 hours away. And none of that was shared with me, of course, because I was a child. And when I found out, it was good riddance to bad garbage. Now back to grandfather. I only knew I was going to be spending 2 weeks, a lot of time, in North Loup, Nebraska, alone with my grandfather, and I was pretty much on my own. Or so I thought. My grandfather went overboard to keep me busy. We went to a fair. We rode a Ferris wheel. We went to a motorcycle show. We attended a demolition derby. And I knew my grandfather didn't enjoy any of that. And when I told him I was happy staying home and watching television together, he ignored me and kept finding new, exciting things for us to do together to waste time. And neither one of us was really interested in continuing. As a fatherless child, I think my grandfather felt a hard calling to be the authoritative man in my life, and he was strict and hard with me. When we'd practice baseball together, and as a young child, that meant going into his garage with a wiffle ball and a plastic bat, with him tossing the ball to me and me hitting it, and me then going after the ball to bring it back to him for the next pitch. And since my grandfather was pitching a wiffle ball underhanded to me 3 feet away, it took every effort of skill I had not to hit the ball right back into his overlapping gut. I always aimed for a ground ball that would slide through his legs and not travel too far for my later retrieval. Well, one day, my grandfather decided we should go golfing, hit a few balls together. And I must have been around 10 or 11, and I'd never been golfing. And no, North Loup, Nebraska did not and does not have a golf course. So we dumped an old set of wooden shaft golf clubs into the trunk of his silver 1966 Plymouth Fury 2 with pause traction, and we were off to the local baseball field to do our golfing. And the baseball field wasn't really anything like a field of play. It was basically an empty lot. There was knee-high milkweed everywhere and the remnants of a base runner path, and a rickety sort of backstop made of chain-link fence and barbed wire. My grandfather instructed me to put down the golf ball near where home plate was supposed to be and give the ball a whack. He stood ready at second base, as if he was going to catch the golf ball and not just, golf clap as a spectator observing my mighty stroke. And I told him I'd never golfed in my life. I had no idea what club to use, and he didn't know either because he didn't golf and he didn't know of an iron from a club or whatever to use, so I just picked a club with a metal head, balanced the cracked and split golf ball on a large piece of gravel, and I tried my best to imitate what I'd seen golfers do on TV. Well, what happened next stopped my heart. And that moment still haunts me today. I hit that golf ball as hard as I could, and at that tender age, that ball took off like a bullet of fire, and that ball headed straight for my grandfather's head. I stood there frozen, my grandfather's life flashing before my eyes. In a split second, I saw him down on the ground, with a golf ball lodged in his head. I wondered how I'd get him into the car. I knew how to drive. He'd taught me that on the dirt back roads of the Loup Valley, just in case of such a life-defying emergency. And this was all happening in the late 1970s, so there were no cell phones, and we were stuck out in the middle of nowhere, no neighbors, nobody but the dead in the graveyard up the hill. But driving the car by myself, I worried and I wondered if I would be able to see over the steering wheel enough without sitting on his lap for that northwest 11-mile drive to the hospital in Ord. I only hoped I'd be stopped by the sheriff for speeding and that he'd give us an escort in his orange pickup truck. I also determined I could give my grandfather CPR if it came to that. I knew what to do, but all I could think of at that moment was how I was going to explain this to my mother. How I had killed her dad with a golf ball. A couple of years previous, I'd purposefully shot out the back window of my grandfather's Plymouth Fury II with pause attraction, using the BB gun, and Granddad knew what I'd done. But he blamed it on a ricochet to stop my mother from screaming at me. And as soon as she heard his insurance would replace the broken window, I was off the hook. But then, now, there would be no claim of a ricochet or salvation by insurance. No, my grandfather was dead for sure. As my vision blurred and my knees weakened, I heard my grandfather yelling at me from the grave. "Davy! Where'd the ball go?" And by some greater power I did not understand then, and definitely do not understand now, my grandfather's life was saved, as I realized the golf ball had taken the tiniest crooked curve away from his forehead as it whizzed over the top of his scalp. I still see it all now clearly, right now with you, in super slow motion. My grandfather patted down his whizzed-by tuft of gray and silver hair and yelled at me again, "Davy, where'd the ball go?" And there he was, Grandfather, Bill Vodehnal, pharmacist to the stars, alive, not dead by a golf ball or ricochet. And I bravely stammered out the truth and shouted back, "It went right over your head and almost killed you." And Grandfather replied, "Okay then, go find the ball and hit it again." And that was that. No yelling, no blame, no death, no funeral up at the graveyard. Nothing but the fact of nothing happened that could have happened. And Grandfather and I moved on to keep trying again. And I know now that death wasn't averted or defeated. Death is always there around us, floating there in the mist. But sometimes death is more busy than the living. And that was a valuable lesson that still haunts me today. A few years after our first and only golfing event, my grandfather died after many years of suffering with a bad heart. His daughters sold his home and the pharmacy out of need, not necessity. And he regretted it for the rest of his life as he whittled away the remainder of his life in the B-Wing nursing home part of the Ord Hospital. Grandfather wanted to move to Lincoln to live with us and have better access to health care, but my mother wouldn't have any of that, for she had escaped her small-town notions. And she didn't want to be back under her father's big toe. And so William Henry Vodehnal, aged 76 or so, died in a tiny cinder block hospital on a hill in Ord, Nebraska, closing the circle of where he began. And the hard fact that the Ord Hospital would not allow children under the age of 14 to visit anyone in the ICU scribbles the final sad chapter of my last memories of my grandfather. As I would scramble around the outside of the hospital ICU and stand on a rock I'd found on tippy toes, so I'd be just tall enough to peek into the open window of his room, to say hello, and to let him know I was there. Well, over here. And that's the bitter truth about how a life ends. Sometimes it finishes in the shot of a fiery golf ball. And other times, it's all over in the soft, final whispers of, "I'm here," spoken both ways through an open hospital window. Thank you for listening. Be a human me.